Hello, I'm Cliff Brockman with the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. Today is November 18th, 2024. This is another of our oral history interviews. And today we're talking with Kris Ketz of KMBC TV in Kansas City. Kris grew up, though, in the Quad Cities. His dad was a well-known anchorman there, Jim King. And so we wanted to talk to Kris today about his career. He's had a tremendous career in his own right. So, Kris, thanks for joining us today.
Cliff, it is an absolute pleasure to be with you. And if I may, just for a moment, I would like to really say thank you and congratulate everybody in your organization for doing what you are doing and have done for a couple of years now. The fact that you're able to capture these stories of, and I don't include myself in this category, just so you know, but the fact that you have recorded the stories of so many broadcast legends in the great state of Iowa, and those stories are now captured forever. I wish, we all did this kind of work that you're doing right now. Listen, I've been following you guys and your work for a long time, and again, I think you guys deserve a ton of credit for what you're doing, what you've done. And my goodness, the value of having these stories for future generations, I can't put a price on the work that you're doing. It's truly remarkable, and you should be congratulated, and guys should be patting yourselves on the back for doing this.
Well, it's very kind of you. Paul Yeager and I enjoy doing these. It's great to hear stories from people who've been in the business for a long time. We really enjoy it. Been a fun thing for us. Let me back up then, and I mentioned that Jim King was your dad. What was it like growing up in the Quad Cities with a famous anchorman for a dad?
You know what? Listen, it was great. The thing about, and it wasn't so much growing up as Jim King's kid, but I grew up at a time in the Quad Cities in the 60s and the 70s, and I didn't come to Kansas City until the 4th of July, 1983. But the time that I grew up in the Quad Cities, it was a wonderful time to be in the Quad Cities. And I'm a product of Moline High School and St. Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa. And listen, my first job, I was still a senior in high school when I was hired to read weekend news at what was then WQUA Radio in Moline. And the thing about WQUA at that time, and this would have been the summer of 1977, okay? The thing about that time and that particular radio station, WQUA had a news department that was a 6-person staff, okay? Which, if you stop and think about it, I'm not even sure that there are radio stations in Kansas City, a market the size of ours, that can say that. But here's the thing about WQUA. When I joined that radio station, they had just won a National Headliners Award. And the news director then, at the time, the legendary Mark Minnick, who of course has been had such a huge influence on your organization and certainly broadcast news in the state of Iowa. But Mark was my first news director. Mark was the guy who gave me my first job in the business. And I was at the time working my way through school at St. Ambrose, but I knew that a college degree for me was necessary, because what I'm doing right now is what I've always wanted to do. I go back to when I was a kid. But listen, I learned so much about broadcast journalism, about radio. My radio experience, I think, has made me a much better person to do television. The things that I learned from people like Mark Minnick and Dan Scott and Nora Sanders and Norm Cooling and Roger Staff and I'm probably forgetting somebody, Dick Ludke, Greg Schulte, that list goes on and on. To be able to, again, a kid who was just barely out of high school, but who knew this is what he wanted to do, and to be in a newsroom with those professionals, and again, to watch those people work, and I listen, I knew, I was smart enough at least to know that even reading the weekend news on a radio station as great as WQUA was, that I was probably in way over my head, okay? But I think I've always given myself some credit. I always thought if I just kept my mouth shut and watched how these people worked, I might learn something. And here I am later, having just finished, about to finish my 41st year here at KMBC Television in Kansas City, and I'll be here for at least another 3 more. But again, I've been lucky enough to be surrounded, whether it was at WQUA Radio in Moline, or the year and a half I spent at WQAD in Moline, or the 41 years that I've spent here at KMBC in Kansas City. I've been surrounded by tremendous people, and I have benefited greatly from watching how all of these people worked down through the years.
Well, you left radio then and went to TV, as you mentioned, to WQAD. Why did you make that jump to TV?
You know, I got, Michael Billy was the news director at Channel 8 at the time, and they needed a weekend anchor. And here's where, and I knew this at the time, and I don't think it was any great secret to anyone, but being Jim King's son, especially in the Quad Cities, especially in Moline, had its advantages. And this was a big one. There was no question about it. Does Michael Billy even look at me, had it not been for the fact that I was Jim King's son and was working in radio at the time? Probably not. But I was lucky enough to realize that I was, for whatever reason, I was given an advantage, and it was a blessing. And again, being Jim King's son opened doors that never would have happened otherwise. And so I've always been grateful of that, and I don't think it's been anything that I've taken advantage of, but I've always been I've always considered myself extremely fortunate to be in situations like this. So Michael Billy offers me a job to do weekend news at Channel 8. My first co-anchor was Andrea Zinga, who not long ago you had a chance to spend some quality time with on this particular show, and I watched that show with Andrea with great interest, because I think back to what would have been 1981. Just getting into television, again, knowing that I had so much to learn, knowing that I was probably in way over my head, knowing that it would be even money that I would last a year. But again, being around really good people like Andrea, that if I kept my mouth shut and watched how these people work, I might learn something. And I haven't seen Andrea in years, and she looked just fabulous in the interview that you guys did with her not too very long ago. But if I ever get a chance to see her, I will want to give her a big hug, and I will want to apologize for what a lousy co-anchor I must have been. This 21-year-old kid being on TV with an established professional like Andrea was, and what she must have thought at the time of, who is this kid trying to read the news with me? And she was right for thinking that, believe me. I don't want you to think otherwise. But there's so many people along the way that I have thanked and continue to want to thank for being where I am today. And she's one of them.
Well, then you made a big jump in market size, went to KMBC from Channel 8. How did that come about?
Sheer luck. Sheer luck, Cliff. The news director at the time at WQAD left Channel 8 and came to KMBC here in Kansas City, a guy named Pat McCarthy, who kind of, when he joined Channel 8 way back when, kind of blew the place up a little bit and received some notoriety for that. And there were some major anchor changes at the time. Some of those changes involved me, and again, I found myself in a position and doing something that I was anchoring a primetime newscast with Al Van Zee and Catherine Bond. Again, 2 more people who I can't tell you how much I learned watching those 2 guys work. And again, doing a job where I knew I was in way over my head. But Pat got the job here in Kansas City, and what was ironic about that time was Pat and I weren't really speaking to each other for about the last 4 or 5 months of my time at WQAD. We had gotten kind of sideways, and listen, every employee-employee relationship goes through ups and downs, and we were certainly going through a down period. But so Pat gets the job, comes to Kansas City, and literally about a month or two later calls and says, listen, we're changing things down here in Kansas City. I'd like to offer you a job. And what was especially interesting about that offer for me is I always knew in the back of my mind, whether it was my days at WQUA Radio or WQAD television, that if I was going to make a career out of this, I had to get out of the Quad Cities. Not that I wanted to leave the Quad Cities. I mean, it was still a wonderful place to live. It was certainly a wonderful place to raise a family. My mom and dad would be the first ones to tell you that. But I knew that I needed to get out of my father's shadow, which obviously was enormous. And so this was a chance for me to kind of strike out on my own and see if I could do it, quite honestly. And once again, the 4th of July, 1983, I walk into KMBC television for the first time, and I walk into what was then a veteran newsroom in a big city. I knew nothing about Kansas City, had never been there. Knew they had a professional football and baseball team, and at the time they had pro basketball as well. But I knew nothing about Kansas City. But I walked into a building, and I walked into a newsroom specifically where, and some of these names will ring a bell, I know, with you, Cliff, and probably with the audience. In that newsroom to my right was the late, great Edward Lewis, who of course had many years at KWQC up in Davenport. But before he went to Channel 6, he was at KMBC 9 News here in Kansas City, and one of the best. To my left, Michael Mahoney, one of the best broadcast political reporters in the Midwest, bar none. Next to him, another salty veteran by the name of Bob Worley. A couple of months later, one of the best broadcast writers that I've ever been associated with, Bev Chapman. And next to Bev, Peggy Bright. And these are all legendary names, especially in Kansas City broadcast television. And again, I knew I was in way over my head when I came to KMBC on the 4th of July in 1983. But again, I go back to that same thought. If I just keep my mouth shut and watch how these people work, I might learn something. And 41 years later, I guess, if my dad were alive today, the very least he would say would be, well, it appears as if the kid could keep a job. And let me tell you something, in July of 1983, it was even money that I'd last a year.
Well, you have been there a long time. Just tell us a couple of the more memorable stories that you've covered while you've been there.
Well, some of the more memorable stories, certainly, at least in recent years, sports has become such an enormous story in Kansas City, and specifically the success of the Kansas City Chiefs. Never in a million years did I think that I would that I would have a chance to go to not one, not two, but 3 Super Bowls in Miami and in Phoenix, and of course the most recent one in Las Vegas. I never thought in a million years that I'd be able to do what I've done there. Probably my most one of the story that will go, if it were to come to an end tomorrow, there's one story in particular that I loved doing, and I loved how it turned out. It's on YouTube, I believe, and a story that won a couple of awards. It was shot by a guy named Greg Steele, who was again another legendary photojournalist here at KMBC. One of the best ever. But it was a story about 2 families. One family had lost their mid-20s daughter to a car crash on I-435 here in Kansas City. The second family, a mom who needed a heart transplant, who needed a new heart. And when one family lost their daughter, that became a chance for new life for this other family who also lived here in the Kansas City area. And we happened to be there the first time that the heart donor's mom met the recipient. And it was one of it was one of those stories where and we had everybody mic'd up, and we actually did the meeting in the lobby of what is now the Intercontinental Hotel down in the Plaza here in Kansas City. And as I say, we had everybody mic'd up, and we through some really good producing ahead of time, had everything set up, and the meeting was just incredible. And I remember looking at Greg as he was recording all of this on video, and he started tearing up, and I started tearing up, and I remember whispering into Greg's ear, "This will be a great story if I don't screw it up," which is a line that I've used, I can't tell you how many times over the course of 41 years here at KMBC. But just to see how these two families came together because of a tragedy, certainly, and how that horrible time meant new life for this second family. Again, not a story that won a lot of awards, but it was it's just one of those stories that, again, we wanted to get it right, you know, and I think we did. I just finished. I'd never done a documentary before, and we just finished reporting. And this was something that took us about 2 years. And again, I'd never done a documentary before, but we have a unit here at KMBC 9 News in Kansas City where we try to do 4 or 5 what we call chronicles every year. And they're hour-long documentaries where we take one topic and we really delve into it. And I just finished my first documentary on Alzheimer's and the kinds of research that is happening, groundbreaking research really, that is happening right here in Kansas City. And again, it was another one of those stories where we're telling the stories of people who are in the midst of dealing with Alzheimer's, who are concerned about it possibly developing in their families. And again, another one of those stories, Cliff, where as we get into it, I'm saying to myself, I'm whispering to myself, we don't want to screw this up, you know? We want to get this story right. And so anyway, those are some of the more recent stories that come to mind, but certainly over the course of 41 years, I remember the first story I ever did as I walked in the door at KMBC, and it had to do with the then governor of the great state of Kansas, who was John Carlin. I wouldn't have known John Carlin if he were sitting next to me, but I knew who it was. And there happened to be a big story at the time that his wife, the First Lady of Kansas, apparently had spent a bunch of money to have a pool built at Cedar Crest, which is the official residence of the Kansas governor in Topeka. And it's the 4th of July. And so we wanted to report on this story. So the 4th of July, brand new guy, just walking in the door, sent him right back out the door for the hour drive west on I-70 to Topeka. And you need to find the governor of Kansas and stick a mic in his face and ask him about this. And so the chances of us being able to file that night, I think, were slim and none. But through some miracle, we were able to find the governor, and he was gracious enough to do an interview, and we actually filed that story that night. But again, here's a kid who's in a big city that he knows nothing about, but he's around really good people. And the really good person for me that time was one of the best photographers on the face of the planet, for my money, a guy named Tim Twyman, who has won all of the awards and is kind of semi-retired right now, but his son, Turner, is a full-time photographer for us, and let me tell you, he's pretty darn good. He too is somebody who has learned a lot of lessons from his dad. But had it not been for the fact that I was with Tim that day, I don't know that I would have had a story to file for the 10 o'clock news that night.
Broadcast journalism is a family tradition for you, isn't it? Your dad, Jim King, you, and now your son, Jonathan Ketz, reporting. Tell us how he's doing.
Yeah, my oldest son, Jonathan, his first television station out of the University of Missouri School of Journalism was in fact at WQAD in Moline. They actually made him an offer right after he graduated a semester early from Mizzou. And how that came together, I'll never know. But it happened, and it was a great offer, and he took it. And I love to tell people my son's first job out of the University of Missouri School of Journalism was a television station where the street in front of the station and the studio are named after his grandfather. So there was no pressure there whatsoever. Yeah. But he spent 9 wonderful years there. But he always wanted to come back to Kansas City because this was home. And now he's at Fox 4, our competitor across the street, and he's doing terrific work. He really is. I was on KCMO Radio not too very long ago on their morning show, and Pete Mundo, their host, was nice enough to bring up Jonathan. I said, here's the thing about Jonathan. And we had a big story down here several months back in April. There was a big sales tax vote in Jackson County, which is Kansas City, Missouri. It's Independence. And if voters had said yes, it would have meant the continuation of a 3/8 sales tax, which would have helped pay for a new stadium for the Kansas City Chiefs and the Royals, okay? So that was a really, really big story. It continues to be a big story here in Kansas City. But my son Jonathan did some really, really top-notch, strong reporting on that story, and he was and was recognized by not just his peers, but people my age who are in the business who recognize what a really good job Jonathan had done on that story. And I remember telling the guys on KCMO Radio, you know, I watch, as somebody who anchors the 5, 6, and 10 o'clock broadcast here at KMBC, I watch Fox 4's 4 o'clock newscast, where obviously often Jonathan is part of that broadcast. And Jonathan would be reporting on these stories and breaking on these stories about the sales tax vote upcoming. And I would say to myself, why in the hell don't we have that story that Jonathan is reporting right now? And then in the same breath, I'm like, yeah, that's my kid. So, but I'm awfully proud of the reporter that he's become, and he loves reporting. He has no interest in anchoring whatsoever. Maybe that changes, maybe it doesn't. But you know, I shared a lesson with him a long time ago that my dad shared with me, and he was absolutely right. He always felt like to be a good anchor, okay, you needed to be a strong reporter first, okay? You had to have that kind of background first. And I think maybe Jonathan is following that lesson perhaps. I know when they made me a weeknight anchor here at KMBC after being here 11 years, there was a lot about anchoring that I didn't know. There was a lot about anchoring that I thought I would probably never learn. But I thought, if nothing else, I had been a reporter in this city on these streets for 11 years. And if I did nothing else but rely on that experience, that when it came to anchoring the news, I might be okay. And I think it's turned out okay.
Well, you've just signed a new contract there, so you're going to continue on for a while, but what are your future plans?
You know what? Here's my problem. Spirit of full disclosure, I just turned 65 not too long ago. I've been here 41 years. You know, I already play enough golf as it is, a lot like my dad. But I'll tell you, it's still fun to come to work. It's still a hell of a lot of fun to come to work. And I work with some phenomenal people here, not just in front of the camera, but certainly behind the camera. People who don't get near as much credit as they should. I always say, Cliff, and I don't know that my dad ever said this, but I know he would understand it and probably acknowledge it and embrace it as well. I've always considered one of my first, if not the first priority, doing what I do at 5, 6, and 10 Monday through Friday nights. I think my first priority is not to screw up everybody else's hard work here, okay? And that's not to say that doesn't always sometimes happen, sadly enough, but I think not to screw up everybody else's hard work here, because people don't see the kind of effort and the kind of devotion and the kind of commitment that our people have to what we do here 24/7. And you know, the last thing you need is like I say, you know, you don't want to screw up the story. You know, it always goes back to that. You don't want to screw up the story. And I'll tell you, you know, growing up in the Quad Cities, you know, I had some wonderful people to emulate. Certainly my dad was at the top of that list. You know, people like Tom Cornelis, people like Wendy Ellis, who was over at Channel 4, Paul Meinke, another one, Chris Miner, who of course was a colleague of yours and my dad's at Channel 8. Man, if there's a better reporter anywhere than Chris Miner, listen, I'm in Missouri right now, you got to show me. but Chris Miner was Paula Sands, who I grew up with in the neighborhood in Heritage and Moline. Don Ryan, another one. Don Sharp over at 4. If you stop and think about it, the kind of talent that has come out of the Quad Cities and continues to be there, I mean, is really something to see. There's so many names that, the Quad Cities for me was such a wonderful place to grow up, not just personally, but professionally, to be able to watch all of these legendary figures work, and again, just to be in the same business with all of these people is I'm a lucky guy.
One last question, Kris. What would you hope that your legacy would be when people think of you after you've retired?
I don't know that I've given that a whole lot of thought, but since you asked the question, I think I would want people to say that he did it the right way, that he did it honestly, that he tried to tell all sides of a story, and again, that hopefully he just didn't screw it up. I keep going back to that. But again, I think one of the things that has always, even looking back, has impressed me so much about my dad's career and the path that he chose and just how he did his work was that he was just so authentic and genuine, and there was just nothing phony about him. And I don't listen, when I got the anchor job way back when, I always knew at the time, there's a lot about anchoring I don't know and may never learn. But if I do nothing else but rely on my experience as a reporter in Kansas City, and if I did nothing else but just be myself, that's kind of what we do here. We are who we are off the air as much as we are on. If I do nothing else but that, maybe this will turn out.
Very good. Well, Kris, it's been great visiting with you. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely my pleasure, Cliff. Best to you and to Paul, and continued success. And as I said off the top, I think it's so great that you do these. Keep on keeping on.
Thank you very much. Our guest today, Kris Ketz of KMBC TV in Kansas City. I'm Cliff Brockman with producer Paul Yeager for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting.